So now let's give a warm welcome to Larry Abramson, speaking on the media coverage of the 2016 presidential campaign.
Thank you, Norma. Another great welcome. I've only been here a few hours, but the kindness that I've felt here has really been extraordinary. Missoula is really kind too, but you guys do it up special. I want to especially thank the librarian who helped me print out something that I forgot to print out before I got here. It reminded me that in times of need, a librarian is probably your most reliable source of help. Everybody here has been so nice. It kind of reminded me also that as journalists, one of the greatest tools that we have is being nice to people and getting them to trust us, but doing it in a sincere way and making sure that they understand that you really respect them. And I think that's something that gets lost sometimes in the daily coverage. And on a day like today, it's no wonder why that sense might get lost. I felt it was sort of a dirty trick to have me driving over here while the President of the United States is holding a news conference that I couldn't listen to in my car, of course, because there's you don't have enough bandwidth up in Rogers Pass, I guess. So I need to go back and revise my remarks after I see what the President said about us journalists while we were up there. So I'm supposed to talk about media coverage in the election, but when you're on a journey, it's really good to know where you are starting out before you figure out where you're going. And in order to get this across, I wanted to just look at some quotes about what the news is today. What is the news today? Students, what is the definition of news? What qualifies as news? Too shy. It's the biggest problem, right? When students are new in journalism, they're afraid to shout out. Who has a definition of news for me?
What's going on in the world right now?
What's going on in the world right now? Thank you. Norma's never shy, never hard to get her to talk. Okay, so current events is one definition of the news, right? We want to know what happened, when it happens. We want to know if the president holds a news conference, that's news, right? Of course, we have a new definition of news now. If the president pulls out his smartphone, that's news, right? So that's changed quite a bit. We used to go really long periods of time. President Obama went months and months without holding a news conference. We're not going to have that luxury because this president holds news conferences in the privacy of his chambers with his cell phone. So here's some definitions of news that I dug up. Walter Lippmann said there can be no higher law in journalism than to tell the truth and shame the devil. Anybody recognize that quote? It's sort of a bastardization of a Shakespeare quote, but it means basically the same thing, and that is that you shame the devil by hauling the truth out and turning your back on falsehoods. Lewis Lapham, people may expect too much of journalism. Not only do they expect it to be entertaining, they expect it to be true. So I met Lewis Lapham, and this is a very characteristic quote from him, because there's a side of journalism we know that goes beyond the truth, right? That is creative and inventive and entertaining. Those of us who are in broadcasting know that sometimes it's more important to be entertaining than it is to be 100% accurate. You can always correct yourself, but you can't go back and be entertaining if you weren't the first time. The conflict between the men who make and the men who report the news is as old as time. News may be true, but it is not the truth, and reporters and officials seldom see it the same way. In the old days, the reporters or couriers of bad news were often put to the gallows. Now they're given the Pulitzer Prize, but the conflict goes on. That's James Reston, the great New York Times journalist. And again, the point here being that the news doesn't tell us everything that we need to know, right? If that was the entire truth about our world, it would be a very impoverished existence that we live. So we go elsewhere for the entire truth. Sometimes I have the feeling that when I go to the movies, when I see Hollywood movies, I'm actually getting a better representation of what real life is like than I do from the news. But I wouldn't dispense with my news just in order to go to the movies all the time, although I'm maybe in retirement, that's what I'll be doing. I don't really know. I have a motto. My job is not to make up anybody's mind, but to make the agony of decision-making so intense that you can only escape it only by thinking. And that's from Fred Friendly, a great broadcaster from CBS. Again, this points to our role as people who are supposed to make you feel uncomfortable, right? The truth hurts. So you might not like hearing what the reality is behind the truth, but I'm going to rub your nose in it. I'm going to make you, and I see we have the Great Falls Tribune represented in the back. I think that's Jim Strauss. Probably a lot of times you serve up the news and people say, no, that's not what I want to hear about. Or I don't like what you're saying. You say, well, this is daily. That's right. Well, and he's the boss, so he's the one who hears about it. So I just want to step back a little bit and skip my slide, and just ask, how are you feeling? And I don't mean, I don't want to hear about your aches and pains, but how are you feeling information-wise? How are you feeling about the information flow that's coming into you? How many of you are going to make it through this talk without checking your smartphone to see whether you're missing? You are. Does that mean you are going to make it through, or you've already checked your smartphone and it's too late because there's a better meme going on somewhere else? Yeah. I know Beth told her students to leave the smartphones outside in the car, and probably had an argument with them about that. So I think we all feel a little bit overwhelmed by the number of sources of information that we have to confront. How many of you listen to NPR? Good. Okay, I'm glad to hear it. I hope you were listening when I was on the air too. Any Twitter fans in the audience? Yeah, okay, a few. So Montana's not big on Twitter. I don't know what it is. We have the same problems. We have to force our students to use Twitter. And back in DC, of course, it was everybody's bread and butter. Fox News, go ahead, you can admit it, right? We're in a red state. No shame there. Facebook, probably everybody, right, just to keep up with your kids. No, not so many. Really? Okay, well, that's surprising. The New York Times, can't get it delivered out here, right? Yeah, but many of us read it online. I don't know how I would get through the day without the New York Times. I think it's been probably the single most influential factor in my decision to become a journalist. Just reading something that really chronicled the depth and breadth of what the world has to bring, and constantly impresses me, and also disappoints me. But I couldn't live without it. Breitbart.com? No? How many of you knew what Breitbart.com was before this election? You did? Okay. So, of course, now this is a very influential, I don't know if I want to call it a source of news, but it's an influential website, right? It gave us one of the chief advisors to the president, and it's something that we're having to become familiar with. InfoWars, Alex Jones, I see there's somebody in the back, has too much free time on his hands, obviously. A little bit more in your face, kind of screaming match, I would call it. But to each his own. I'm not here to judge anybody for the sources of news that they choose, and it would be presumptuous of me to do that, because plenty of you have sources of information that I have no access to, like your friends and your family and your personal experience. And that's news too, right? That can also be a source of information that's very important to you. And I almost forgot about John Oliver, who I think is actually on the verge of becoming one of the better reporters out there despite himself. So we're dealing with all these sources of information, and I find it overwhelming, and I'm in the business. I think that the election has brought home the fact that we have witnessed such a dramatic increase in information sources that we are beginning to suffer a new kind of future shock. Anybody here familiar with this title of this book, or maybe more familiar with it now because Alvin Toffler died last year? The author of this, who basically talked a little bit about the discombobulation that we feel with the fact that technology is changing faster than our capacity to deal with. We can't evolve as quickly as technology is changing. But it's important to note that one of the lessons of this book, which for the younger people in the audience, came out, I think, in 1970, was that we need to develop coping strategies to deal with this rapid technological change. It wasn't an option to just resist it or complain about it all the time, that we have to figure out how to deal with it. And some of us deal with it in different ways. Some of us do it by turning off. Some of us do it by diving in even deeper and simply being immersed in the information all the time. But that we really, this is a sort of a personal responsibility I think citizens face today, is to figure out a way to deal with all the change. Now, this was a topic of a lot of discussion when I was growing up, when Future Shock came out in the 1970s. I sort of have the feeling that people today are talking about the information flow a great deal, but they're not doing it in as creative a way as they did in the 70s. Who knows who this guy was? Can you help me with the name? I'm a teacher, so it's Peter Finch, right? That was, and his character in the movie was Howard Beale from a movie called Network, that talked a little bit about the control that network television, remember network television, was having over our lives at the time. And Howard Beale kind of was both a purveyor of information and a victim of it. He kind of cracked up and decided that he wasn't going to take it anymore. And he stuck his head out the window and he screamed out those words, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." And what happened? Everybody else stuck their head out the window and said, "Yeah, you're right. We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore." So I'm mixing my metaphors here a little bit, but I think this election is kind of a similar phenomenon to what we had here, that we had a president who stuck his head out the window via Twitter and via lots of other media and via cable news, and he got a tremendous echo of response from the people who are out there who are also really angry. So I don't know what lesson to draw from that, but that this is a recurring theme, right, that we have to deal with, that people are fed up and they're going to rebel in some sort of way. Yes, so today we have this path-breaking, icon-smashing billionaire who's mastered some information dissemination techniques that I would argue are actually pretty old. But he's thrown at some new challenges in the way of our sense of humanity. And say what you will, Trump has elicited a response from the world and from the media in particular. So he's getting our goat in a very important way. And he's getting not just my goat, but your goat too, because I meet people all the time who say, "I'm upset." They're upset about what's going on. They can't always define why, but their politics is influencing their mood. And that doesn't happen that often, at least in my experience. So what have we learned from this election about the media and about the digital revolution? Well, let's look at some things that the media has said about the media. We reporters talk and blog and write and tweet for a living, and we are endlessly self-referential today because we feel ourselves threatened. We feel threatened by a society that seems to honor our work less and less, and so we ask some of the same questions over and over again. Why are we here? What is our job? We remain obsessed about being right, about getting the story right, and rightfully so. And we're eager to self-flagellate when we get it wrong, as we've done so spectacularly in the past election. We blew it, right? This is a feeling that you will hear privately or publicly from many journalists, that either we blew it or maybe you blew it. Maybe the public blew it, because we guys voted, right? So somewhere in here there's a finger pointing going on. Or maybe it wasn't our fault. Maybe it was the trolls. Maybe it was the people out there who are influencing our minds surreptitiously through these memes and things that we don't entirely understand. But be that as it may, we've absorbed some basic facts that have upset our balance. So on November 8th, the Earth was drawn into a rupture in the space-time continuum. We were all sucked into a bizarro galaxy where all of our perceptive abilities were turned inside out, And in the words of the great Ghostbuster, Peter Venkman, we have human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. We can't trust anything we read anymore because the media are at war with the president is at war with the truth, or maybe he's the oracle of truth. He's a seer who's helping us to discern clearly for the first time. Everything seems to have changed. Much of the news we thought was real, much of what we knew about our world, has been called fake by somebody or other. And this is a word we used to use pretty selectively, right? We had fake diamonds and fake pearls, but we didn't have fake news. So I guess this is a new thing, right? I guess we never had fake news before a year ago. And now the word fake news is used by the president and by people who make fake news, right? They're hurling this back at us. So the president is calling CNN and others fake news. And Breitbart and other purveyors of, it's not really journalism, are calling the mainstream media fake news. So you all were involved in name calling in school, right? It's kind of a circular process. It doesn't usually go anywhere. So as you can tell by the underlying sarcasm in my tone of voice, I think a lot of the news about fake news is itself fake news. But let's look at some of the assumptions that have been battered around since the election. So we've learned that voters self-segregate, okay? So people read stuff that reinforces their opinion, or at least that's one of the conclusions that some people drew from the election. And since there are more sources of this reinforcing news, you can go to the Twitter feed that tells you what you already wanted to know. So if you think that Hillary is a terrible person, you can go to a Twitter feed that has more evidence that she was running a child sex ring? I don't know. I used to eat at the Comet Pizza Parlor, and there's no basement there. I knew that for a fact. So I was immediately suspicious. I caught on to that right away. So what this graph shows you is that right-wing voters tend to view Fox News, or Trump voters view Fox News, and that Clinton voters tend not to go to those sources. And what's also interesting is that this study from the Pew Research Center, which is a really reliable source of information, I have to say, which I'm glad is there, shows that Democratic voters are quite a bit more splintered in their sources of news. We don't have the equivalent of Fox News for liberals. Again, I'm not sure what conclusion to draw from that, but it could point you to the idea that Democrats were just not united enough to elect their president this time. That may have been one of the sources, but that's definitely not definitive. But clearly, Trump voters like Fox News. Now, this self-segregation phenomenon is something that I think we knew already, right? That people tend to be drawn to newspapers or sources of information that they agree with. And why not? I mean, why would you go out and buy something that's arguing with you every day of your life? You know, it's really not human nature. It might be a laudable trait to go out and seek, like Thanksgiving dinner, my Uncle Eddie was this crazy right-wing conservative. I knew he was going to challenge me every time I sat down next to him at the Thanksgiving table. But I didn't go visit Uncle Eddie every single day and try to argue with him. It was a once a year kind of thing. So I think this self-segregation thing is, it may be a problem, but it's something that's really pretty understandable. Now, news organizations are sensitive to the fact that they need to diversify their audiences, that they need to broadcast or write or tweet to people who are not in their core audience, right? They're not part of their base. And we do that. When I was at NPR, we tried to attract young people who unfortunately were not part of our core audience. We tried to solicit the attention of African Americans who really were not part of the public radio audience. I think we also were sensitive to the fact that we needed to reach out to the right wing. that we needed to include those voices in our stories. And I have to say, as a reporter, I tried damned hard every story I went to, every story I was involved in, to go out and talk to somebody who was as far from the mainstream, as far on the other side of the issue as I possibly could. That was my mission in life. And I spent a lot of time riding around with conspiracy theorists and gun owners for George Bush and other people, and desperately trying to understand where do their opinions come from. They didn't necessarily, I didn't have to share their beliefs. I didn't have any beliefs. Good reporters don't really view themselves as being, propounders of a certain point of view. You're just curious about how all these people think. But it doesn't always work. We don't always get outside of our bubble, and I think that the mainstream media have to admit that that sometimes we need to try harder to understand people who live in other neighborhoods than we do. One of the overwhelming phenomena that I think keeps the media segregated is the fact that most large media organizations in this country are concentrated on the coasts. And since we're not in the coast now, we can talk about those people as being the other people. They used to be my neighbors, but now they're other people. The Washington Post, Jim Tankersley points out that if you want a reporting job today, your best bet is to move to DC, LA, or New York. They were home to almost 1 in every 5 reporting jobs in 2014, this is a couple years old, up from 1 in 8 in 2004. And we know this, that local bureaus have been shutting down. The Washington Post shut down a lot of its local bureaus. They shut down international bureaus because some of the feeling was, well, we have all this technology now. We don't have to have people living in these communities all the time in order to get a bead on where the country is going. We'll just make a phone call. And that's a problem. I mean, here I am, I'm in Great Falls, Montana. How many of you think the mainstream media care about what you think here in town? Yeah, they don't really know. They don't come out here. We didn't send people out here on a regular basis. Although I did edit a series of stories about Montana when I was an editor once. But in my years at NPR, we wrestled with this problem all the time. Our organization was in Washington, D.C., which on some level was the worst place in the world to have, because we had a beltway around us, which is this constricting structure that kept you from seeing outside of it, supposedly. And we really tried hard to get outside of that bubble. And we did have a national network of reporters, of amazing reporters, many of whom are still in place. But we also had a network of freelancers that was part of the public radio system. Does anybody, there's probably no public radio reporters here tonight, but the Montana Public Radio and Yellowstone Public Radio do an amazing job of staying close to the ground and occasionally filing reports. A lot of the coverage on the reception of immigrants in Montana has come from Montana Public Radio. I don't know if you all have had a chance to hear those stories, but they were terrific, and thank God that NPR still pays attention to those people. And NPR is also developing a larger collaboration to try to enhance this network. A good friend of mine, Bruce Oster, is heading up this effort to try to get more station pieces on and get more input from stations. And we can hope that when the next election comes around, this networks like this will help inform the coverage. And there's also a Washington Post network right now of 2,800 freelancers who have basically just signed on a computer login. It's called the Washington Post Talent Network. I would actually include the students in this audience to sign up. I don't know exactly how this works, but apparently they will use you as a news source if you offer something up or if they need something from your corner of the world. So kind of an interesting thing. So let me say that a supportive word, however, for the parachute journalism that I was just making fun of, and that is that it is important to have outsiders come into your community and cast a skeptical eye at what you're doing. I don't think it worked out in the election very well because obviously we would have foreseen what was going to happen if we'd have done that better. But it is important to have people come from Washington and Los Angeles into your community. We have an interesting phenomenon here with public radio. Kirk Ziegler, who grew up in Missoula, now works out of NPR's LA Bureau and occasionally parachutes in. He was just in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, talking about for one of his stories. So I believe in the free exchange of ideas and the free movement of reporters to go wherever they want to. And some of the students who come to me, I do tell them, go to New York, build a career, you can always come back. And I hope that they do come back. At the same time, good journalists will continue to struggle with their biases. And journalism is supposed to be a struggle. You're supposed to be examining yourself all the time. That's one of the reasons some of us get into this, is that we like the internal battle that goes on. And we try to keep examining, are we showing favoritism to anybody? So one of the other lessons from the campaign was supposed to be that there just wasn't any good coverage. We were totally distracted by Donald Trump's rallies, and by the people shouting horrible things at those rallies, and by Hillary Clinton's emails, and we just didn't pay attention to any of the issues that were out there. I don't buy that. I mean, do any of you feel like there was a shortage of good coverage about the economy, about the war in Afghanistan, and about the campaign itself? The New York Times, a year before the election, did path-breaking coverage of Donald Trump's non-payment of income taxes. David Farenthold of the Washington Post did stories about Trump's claims that he had donated millions of dollars to charity, which turned out to be not true. And if you want to hear David Farenthold, he's coming to the School of Journalism on March 13th, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how he did that. There are other examples, I didn't put them on here, of good coverage of the Clinton campaign. But I think there was a tremendous amount of good coverage. It might have gotten lost in the wash of campaign coverage that went on. And personally, I feel like we cover campaign events too much. I used to argue that at NPR all the time. I'm not saying anybody listened, but I think a campaign event it's an artificial event, and we really should back off of that kind of coverage. There's plenty of other problems in this country to be covered, and not to be distracted by those events. But I wouldn't look to that changing anytime soon. So the other sort of lesson we're supposed to have learned is that an epidemic of lies around the country and by the government is undermining our faith in journalism, our faith in government. Some people would accuse the Obama administration of having engaged in an epidemic of lies. Certainly people have accused the very young Trump administration of engaging in this practice. And I can only quote I.F. Stone, another great investigative journalist, in saying that all governments lie. I was in Washington for 30 years, and I covered different administrations from George Bush and Ronald Reagan and the other Bush and Obama for 8 years. They all lied to me. They all lied to us. Sometimes it could be characterized as spin, and sometimes it could be, wishful thinking. They all thought that their education programs were making the public schools better. They all thought that they were going to end the wars in Nicaragua and Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq again. They all gave us the message that they thought the American people wanted to hear. This is just how things work. We didn't call it lying under Ronald Reagan. We called it misstatements of fact. We called it a scandal. We called it whatever was appropriate at the time. But we didn't call it lying. And This is a hot topic among some journalists right now as to whether or not to use this lie. This was another example of a bold-faced lie under the Obama administration when the Director of National Intelligence told a Senate committee that just before the revelations that Edward Snowden brought about the mass surveillance of Americans, is there mass surveillance? And he said, no, sir. This happens all the time. Sometimes we just forget about it. Now, the New York Times has decided that in the case of the Trump administration, they're going to call a lie a lie. They call it a lie. I don't know if they've called him a liar, but this is kind of new, right? This is a bold step. This would make me very uncomfortable if I was an editor. I'll ask Jim afterwards if he has had a newsroom talk with his reporters about whether or not they should refer to it. Of course, the fact that you're in Great Falls gives you a little bit of distance from Mr. Trump, but you probably occasionally have to decide how you're going to edit your headlines. NPR, my former employer, has decided not to use the word lie, and they had a discussion on the air with the new Vice President of News, Mike Oreskes, and Mary Louise Kelly, an intelligence reporter. Why not? Why don't you call what the President Trump said, I think it was about the size of the inauguration crowds, why don't you call that a lie? And I have to agree with them in saying that a lie is intentional deception. And unless you can read the mind of the person who is making that statement, you really cannot call it a lie. If you want to be factual, then you have to be sure that you're 100% correct. Some people are convicted of lying in court, they're liars. We don't usually call them liar, we call them an ex-con or something like that. But it's very, very rare that you catch somebody in a lie where you know that they know something and can prove that they said the opposite despite knowing better. If you talk to conspiracy theorists, they don't think they're lying. I used to interview people who were convinced 10 years after 9/11 that it was an inside job, that the government did it. They didn't think they were lying. They were misleading themselves. Some of them were unbalanced, but they weren't lying. So I happen to agree with NPR's decision on this. We shouldn't call it a lie, and it doesn't weaken our argument that it's reprehensible to tell lies. It's reprehensible to say that climate change doesn't exist when 99% of the world's scientists agree that it does. But you don't have to call it a lie. Once you do that, you basically alienate most of your audience.
What do you call it then?
You can call it a falsehood. You can call it you can call it whatever is appropriate at the time. And this is a usage question, which really does, journalism is an unregulated industry. We make decisions in our individual newsrooms. The Society of Professional Journalists can yell at me for what I did, and my fellow journalists can chastise me in public, but it's up to the individual newsrooms. And most newsrooms make sound decisions because they're well run. So this quote is from a column by the NPR ombudsperson about the question of whether or not to use the lie word. And when asked about this, Mike Oreskes said, "We're not at war with the president." And I think this is an important thing to remember, is that especially today, after a news conference that was mostly about, apparently, I told you I missed most of it, mostly about the media, we're not at war with the president. We can take the abuse. You have to suck it up. People have called me names and insulted me. It's not supposed to bother you. You're supposed to get over it. You can go fume at home over a scotch and soda, but please don't let that infect your work. Every day, reporters in the White House should be able to go into that briefing room and look objectively, listen objectively to what these guys are saying, and not hold a grudge from the previous day, like saying, I'm going to get this guy because he lied to me yesterday, or because Sean Spicer acted ridiculously yesterday. I think that is unprofessional behavior. And I'd say it's easy for me now at the journalism school. I'm not at these news conferences now, so it's why you get into academia, so you can poke fun at people who are actually doing the job. But shouting is fun, but it's not about us as journalists. So once we start to rebel against the president's depiction of us and make that the story, then I think we're abrogating our responsibility. And I'll see if I can play this little bit of video, which I'm sure you all have seen.
It's a disgrace what took place. It's a disgrace, and I think they ought to apologize and start with Michael Trump.
Sir, since you're attacking us, can you give us a question? Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
Mr. President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization,
Not
can
you.
you give us a chance?
Your organization.
You are attacking our news organization.
Your organization.
Can you give us a chance to ask a question, sir?
Go ahead.
Sir,
Quiet.
can you state,
Quiet.
Mr. President-elect,
Go ahead.
can you state
She's asking
categorically,
a question.
Mr.
Don't be rude.
President-elect, can you give us a question?
be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be.
Can you
I'm
give
not
us a
gonna give you-
question?
I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir,
Go ahead.
can you state categorically that nobody, no, Mr. President-elect, that's not
Go ahead.
appropriate.
It's not appropriate. Okay, well.
Let's suppose that you're writing
sorry.
a really important email to a colleague.
No, let's not.
Or
Okay. So here's my problem with that. I mean, again, I don't know Jim Acosta, the CNN reporter who was being chastised. But again, this is turning the media into the story, right? The president attacked me, therefore I have to take over the news conference. Now, it's worth pointing out that this was before the president was inaugurated, so it wasn't a White House briefing. I think he would have been escorted out of the White House briefing room if he had acted like that. But if the president isn't answering your question, the decorous thing to do is to get one of your colleagues to ask the question over again. That's what we used. I don't know if you ever did that, Norma, but we would just say, we're going to ask the same question over and over again. We're going to keep trying to nail this guy to the wall. But the shouting and interfering with the right of the next reporter to ask a question, sorry, that just does not work for me. And I really cringe when I see that kind of stuff. Now, the other, so let's deal a little bit more with the fake news phenomenon. Some people would say that the bright side of fake news is that it's going to keep reporters in donuts for a long time, right? Now we have a new reason for being, right? There's all this news that has to be fact-checked. And actually, I would say, as a credit to my profession, all kinds of fact-checking sites are springing up. Factcheck.org and individual fact-check sites are, not to mention old ones like Snopes.com, which has been around for years. Anybody use Snopes? It's a rumor site, right? But it checks out rumors that you and your friends talk about all the time. This is actually a kind of a fun enterprise, things that people think are true and trying to bring them down. So here's a Breitbart.com article about a supposed attack on a church in Germany on New Year's Eve that said that a 1,000-man mob, it doesn't say here, but they're all Arab immigrants, supposedly set a church on fire, like Muslims attacking Christianity or something. That was in Breitbart.com. So, you see something like this and you go, well, that would be terrible. I'm going to go see if that's true. And of course, it turns out not to be true. The church, basically, it was just a New Year's Eve celebration. They get carried away in Germany. Actually, I've been there. They shoot bottle rockets. One of the bottle rockets landed in the scaffolding around a church and started a little tiny fire. And the fire department, which knows it should be out ready on New Year's Eve in Germany, put it out right away. And it wasn't some kind of conspiracy against Christianity. Now, this is great. Here's a good article. We learn our lesson. Of course, the challenge is that we don't know that the people who read this are going to see that, right? You never know whether everybody's operating with the same baseline understanding. But the bigger concern that I have is that the more time we spend fact-checking statements by the president and by his press secretary and by all the people out there now who have opened up websites, is that we're not going to be examining the real problems facing this country, like poverty and drug abuse and poor education in the schools and God knows what else. I mean, these are all stories that all of the journalists in the world work on all the time and still need attention. They are still problems. And if we're simply fact-checking outrageous statements, I'm concerned that there's going to be less of that. Some people are certain. Some people feel that the answer to the fake news problem is a technological one, and I think this is kind of an interesting idea. How many of you remember a time when your inboxes were so full with spam that you couldn't use your email? Yeah, not so many? I do. I did a lot of stories about this. There was federal legislation, there was the Canned Spam Act. This was going to shut down the internet economy. We still get spam, right? A little bit. It's not so bad anymore. Most of it goes right to your trash box, right? You have filters. The internet filtering service that's part of your web, part of your internet service basically has dealt with this. They figured out a way to code for it so that it disappears. It's possible that we could do that with fake news. I think it's a little bit more complicated because fake news always has a little bit of truth mixed up into it, and I would worry about where that's going to go. But who knows? Maybe we won't be talking about this in 4 years. Facebook has rolled out a news filtering service in Germany because of increasing pressure there and the responsibility that the government places on websites that promulgate erroneous news. We'll see how that works out. There's also been a strong public service sensibility around fake news. This is from On the Media, an NPR program, that just talks about altering your behavior to make yourself less susceptible to bullshit, to stuff that you really shouldn't be paying any attention to. Some people know this stuff, some people need a little education about it, just like we did with a lot of internet behavior. Anything that's in all caps or an obviously photoshopped picture is a reason for suspicion. If there are a lot of pop-ups and banner ads, if you go to Breitbart.com, you get inundated with ads. Check the domain. Sometimes fake sites have .co, which, no, I can't remember. I think that means it's registered, a website registered in Colombia. Don't fact check me on that. I think that's right. If you land on an unknown site and you want to investigate it, students, check the About page. Sometimes the About page, like who are you, what is this organization, will immediately clue you into the fact that somebody is pulling your leg. So lots of other places that you can go that are basically common sense barometers as to whether or not this is a legitimate website. And I think the most important thing here, which is probably the hardest thing to implement, if you're not sure it's true, don't share it, right? Because fake news is a self-replicating virus. It's the fact that that my stepmother sends me everything that she sees that she thinks is interesting or funny, but basically she's compounding the problem by doing that because she's giving them a hit, right? They got forwarded. They're going to get some kind of payment off of that. To me, the biggest problem in the fake news section of this whole problematic that we're looking at is that there is no tool as sharp as an educated mind when it comes to figuring out what's true and what's not. 1/3 of Americans, this is from, well, it's a poll. Hopefully it's an accurate poll. 1/3 of Americans don't know that Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are the same thing. All right? So when opponents of the Affordable Care Act referred to this healthcare system, they called it Obamacare, right? That was because it stuck. It was a nice, clean slap that you could direct at it. And people didn't know that it was originally called the Affordable Care Act. It was supposed to make healthcare affordable. But many people are confused about that. Maybe they voted for somebody who wanted to destroy it because they thought that it had nothing to do with affordability or anything else. So just a small example of the fact that when we go into these elections, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of ignorance out there. And that's why I'm in the education business. I really do believe that exposure to lots of sources of information, exposure to different points of view, exposure to professors from diverse backgrounds makes you sharper and gives you a stronger sensibility when it comes to judging this stuff. And then, in the end, you guys still decide. You still have to go out and seek out your own news and make your own decisions. Thank you very much. I think we will do some questions with Norma's assistance.